welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be unpacking the surprisingly complex world of grenades. I always thought it was pretty straightforward. Pull the pin, throw it, boom. But looking at all this stuff from Wikipedia, I'm starting to think there's way more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. The world of grenades is a lot deeper than most people realize.
Luckily, I've got an expert here with me to help us navigate this explosive journey. So let's get started. What exactly are we talking about when we say grenade? I mean, it's not just those hand-thrown things, right?
You're right. It's a whole category of weapons, not just one specific thing. The term grenade actually includes things like projectiles launched from rifles. Those are called rifle grenades.
Yeah.
And of course, there are grenades launched from, well, grenade launchers.
Interesting. So it's more about how it's delivered than the explosive itself.
Yeah, the delivery method is key. And when it comes to those hand-thrown grenades, they've come a long way. Modern ones are pretty sophisticated with all sorts of safety mechanisms, detonators, and timed fuses. It's a world away from where they started.
Speaking of starting points, I got to ask about the name, why grenades? It sounds kind of fancy, like something you'd see on a dessert menu.
It does have a certain ring to it. The name actually comes from the French word for pomegranate. Believe it or not, early grenades, especially back in the 16th and 17th centuries, they actually looked a lot like the fruit in both size and shape.
Wow, I never would have guessed that. So how far back do these pomegranate-like explosives go? Were ancient armies chucking fruit at each other?
Not fruit exactly, but they definitely had their own versions of grenades. Even before gunpowder was a thing, ancient civilizations were using incendiary weapons that were kind of like early grenades. The Byzantine Empire, for example, they had this weaponized form of Greek fire.
Greek fire. That sounds intense.
It was incredibly flammable. Imagine being on the battlefield and suddenly someone throws a ceramic or glass container full of this stuff at you. Talk about a fiery surprise.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a game changer.
Yeah.
So when did gunpowder enter the scene and really shake things up in the grenade world?
Gunpowder really did revolutionize things. The Song dynasty in China between the 10th and 13th centuries, they developed some of the first gunpowder-based grenades. They called them thunder crash bombs.
Thunder crash bombs.
Right,
That
right.
sounds pretty intimidating.
Oh, they were. Just the name sends shivers down your spine. I was reading about them in the Wujing Zongyao, that old Chinese military text. They described these things being launched into enemy camps, creating deafening explosions and engulfing everything in flames. It sounds terrifyingly effective.
It definitely doesn't sound like a party I'd want to be at.
Huh.
So how did this explosive tech make its way to Europe? Did these thunder crash bombs just suddenly appear on European battlefields one day?
Not quite. It was more of a gradual process. Cast iron bombshells, which you could think of as an early form of grenade, started appearing in Europe around the mid-15th century. They were mainly used in sieges and for defending fortifications.
So more about strategic bombing than individual soldiers lobbing them around.
Yeah, in those early days, grenades were definitely more of a strategic tool. But as technology improved, armies began to realize just how useful they could be for close-quarters combat.
I've heard about these specialized grenade-throwing soldiers that emerged in European armies. Is that true?
Absolutely. By the mid-17th century, you had units of grenadiers popping up all over European armies. These guys were elite soldiers, specifically trained to use grenades and engage in hand-to-hand combat.
Wow, they must have been some seriously tough dudes.
They were known for their bravery and played a key role in assaults and shock tactics. It was a dangerous job, but someone had to do it.
So how did grenades evolve from there? Was it a smooth progression, or were there any sudden jumps forward driven by conflicts or new technology?
It was a mix of both. You had gradual refinements happening all the time, but there were also these bursts of innovation, often spurred by the demands of war.
Makes sense. When you're in the thick of it, you got to improvise.
Exactly. A great example is the Crimean War. British troops were using empty soda water bottles filled with gunpowder nails and scrap metal as makeshift grenades.
Wow, that's resourceful. Talk about making do with what you've got. Were there other conflicts where this kind of battlefield ingenuity played a big role?
Oh yeah, the Crimean War was just the beginning. The Paraguayan War, the Siege of Mafeking during the Second Boer War, and the Russo-Japanese War all saw similar situations. The effectiveness of these simple but deadly improvised grenades highlighted their importance in certain situations.
So even with all the advancements in tech, there was still a need for good old-fashioned resourcefulness.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. Around the turn of the 20th century, some military minds started questioning the future of grenades.
Really? After all that history, they were suddenly falling out of favor. What happened?
Existing grenades weren't exactly reliable, plus they were pretty dangerous to handle. Some people thought they were becoming obsolete, especially with all the other new weapons being developed.
So grenades were going through a bit of an identity crisis.
You could say that. But ironically, it was the success of those improvised grenades in those very conflicts we just talked about, especially the Russo-Japanese War, that sparked a reevaluation. Military observers saw firsthand how effective these simple explosives could be in trench warfare, and they realized that grenades still had a place on the modern battlefield.
So they were given a second chance to prove themselves.
Exactly. And that led to a renewed push to create more practical, reliable, and safe hand grenades. A bunch of inventors stepped up to the challenge, and that's when things really started to take off in terms of grenade technology.
So who were the big names in this grenade renaissance? Were there any standout figures who really pushed the boundaries?
Several talented individuals made significant contributions. Martin Hale, a British inventor known for the Hale's rifle grenade. He actually developed a pretty modern hand grenade design back in 1906, but he had trouble convincing the British Army to adopt it until 1913.
So someone else beat him to the punch.
His main competitor was a Norwegian inventor named Nils Waltersen Asen. He designed his own grenade in 1906 and patented it in England. Asen was incredibly successful at marketing his grenade all across Europe, especially in France. His design was a huge commercial success, earning him accolades and recognition. He even became a Knight of the French Legion of Honor in 1916.
Wow, that's impressive. But out of all these innovations, was there one design that really changed the game? The one that became the gold standard for modern grenades?
Without a doubt, that would be the Mills bomb developed by William Mills in 1915. It was the first truly modern fragmentation grenade. It had this segmented exterior and an internal matrix designed to create deadly shrapnel upon detonation. Plus, it introduced that iconic pin and lever ignition system that's still used today.
Ah, the famous pineapple grenade. I've seen those in so many movies and video games. It's amazing to think that a design from over a century ago is still so influential.
The Mills bomb was a game changer. It was effective, reliable, and relatively easy to use, making it a favorite among soldiers. While there have been some improvements over the years, the fundamental principles of the Mills bomb are still very relevant.
It's incredible how some designs just stand the test of time. But I'm curious, after World War II, did things just stop there with the Mills bomb, or did grenade design keep evolving?
You might be surprised to learn that even though the basic design hasn't changed drastically since World War II, there's been constant incremental improvement driven by new challenges in warfare and advances in technology and materials.
So it's not just about the classic pineapple anymore. There's more to modern grenades than meets the eye.
Absolutely. A good example is the Swedish spring hand granate O7, or Skigear O7 for short. It was introduced in 2012.
Okay, that name is definitely a mouthful. What makes this Swedish grenade so special?
Well, for one thing, it's self-righting. It always lands in a way that maximizes its effectiveness. And it actually jumps before exploding, scattering nearly 2,000 pellets in a cone about 10 meters wide and 2 meters high.
That sounds incredibly precise for a grenade. I'm guessing that helps reduce collateral damage.
Exactly. It's a lot safer for the user since the fragments aren't just flying off randomly. It was a big step forward in grenade tech, showing that innovation is still happening in this field.
Wow, I had no idea. Grenades were still evolving in such sophisticated ways. So we've got grenades that are designed to fragment, and now we've got jumping grenades. What other kinds of surprises are lurking in the world of grenades?
There are all sorts of grenades out there, each one tailored for a specific tactical purpose. It's not just about blowing things up. Some are meant to concuss, some are meant to burn, and there are even grenades that can temporarily incapacitate someone without killing them.
It's like a whole toolbox of explosive options. This deep dive is getting more and more interesting. What are some of the main types of grenades you'd find in a modern arsenal? I know the Wikipedia article mentioned fragmentation, concussion, anti-tank incendiary sting, and even practice grenades. What sets them all apart?
Let's start with the classic fragmentation grenade. As the name suggests, these are designed to fragment upon detonation, sending out a hail of deadly shrapnel to take out enemies within a certain radius.
So that's your classic throw it and run type of grenade.
Pretty much. A good example is the M67 fragmentation grenade. It has a kill radius of about 5 meters and can cause casualties up to 15 meters away. And here's the kicker. Its fragments can travel over 200 meters. Taking cover is definitely a good idea.
That's a pretty big spread. It sounds incredibly effective, but also incredibly dangerous.
Hmm.
What about concussion grenades? How are those different?
Concussion grenades are all about generating a powerful shockwave instead of relying on fragmentation. They're especially effective in enclosed spaces where that blast pressure gets amplified, like clearing out bunkers or buildings.
So they're more about the boom than the shrapnel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The US MK3A2 concussion grenade, for example, it only has a published casualty radius of 2 meters in open areas. While it might not throw fragments as far as a fragmentation grenade, that concussion effect is the real killer. It's designed for close quarters combat.
I see. So they're perfect for clearing out those tight spaces. Are there any other unexpected uses for concussion grenades?
There are. Some concussion grenades are designed to be used underwater, like the US MK40. They generate a lethal shockwave underwater, making them effective against enemy divers or for taking out underwater infrastructure.
Wow, that's pretty versatile.
Yeah.
So we've got grenades that shred with shrapnel and those that deliver a concussive punch. What about anti-tank grenades? Those sound pretty specialized.
Anti-tank grenades were developed to give infantry a fighting chance against armored vehicles. Back in World War I, they were often used as a last resort when nothing else was available to stop a tank.
So they were like a desperate attempt to take down a tank.
Sometimes, yes. And they could actually be surprisingly effective. But once rocket-propelled shaped charges became more common, the role of anti-tank grenades kind of faded away. They weren't as powerful or as easy to use.
Right. I can see how a rocket launcher would be more appealing than trying to chuck a grenade at a tank. So have anti-tank grenades completely disappeared?
Not entirely. They've seen some limited use in modern conflicts, especially against lightly armored vehicles that might not be as well protected against those shaped charges.
Hmm.
They're not the go-to anti-tank weapon anymore, but they still have a niche.
It's amazing how even older weapons can find new life in unexpected situations. Speaking of different types of grenades, we can't forget about incendiary grenades. Those sound pretty intense.
They definitely are. Incendiary grenades are all about starting fires. They typically use a highly flammable substance like thermite, which burns incredibly hot. They're great for destroying equipment, setting buildings on fire, or just denying access to an area.
I bet those would be pretty devastating. Were there any notable incendiary grenades used throughout history?
During World War II, the British Home Guard used the now 76 Special Incendiary Grenade. They produced millions of them, and they were primarily intended for use against tanks.
Wow, they weren't messing around. So we've got grenades that explode, grenades that concuss, grenades that burn. Are there any that are designed to be, well, less lethal?
There are. Sting grenades, also called sting ball grenades, are designed to incapacitate targets without causing serious injuries.
So how do they work?
They release a bunch of rubber or plastic balls when they detonate, creating a barrage of painful stings. They're often used in riot control situations or when lethal force isn't necessary. They can also be loaded with tear gas for crowd dispersal.
That's a pretty big contrast to the other types of grenades. Are they truly non-lethal, though?
While they're designed to minimize serious injury, sting grenades can still be dangerous. They can cause a lot of bruising and welts, and there have been cases of more serious injuries like eye or hand damage from direct hits.
So they're not completely harmless, but definitely a step down from the more destructive types. Are there any other less lethal options out there?
Of course. There are also practice and simulation grenades used for training. They function similar to live grenades, but just produce a loud pop and a puff of smoke. That way, soldiers can practice throwing and handling grenades without the risk of an actual explosion.
That's a relief. I bet it's a good idea to get some practice in before handling the real deal. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm curious, after all these centuries of development, are we still using the same basic mechanisms to trigger grenades?
That's actually a really interesting aspect of grenade design. It reflects the constant push and pull between innovation and practicality. Early grenades relied on impact detonation, which, as you can imagine, was pretty unreliable and dangerous.
Yeah, I can imagine having a grenade go off in your hand wouldn't be a good time.
Exactly. So time-delayed fuses became the preferred method, and there have been two main approaches to that, friction igniters and strike or percussion igniter.
Okay, break those down for me. How do those mechanisms work?
Friction igniters, like those used in the German Stielhahn involve pulling a cord or twisting a cap to ignite the fuse. Strike igniters, on the other hand, rely on a sharp impact to activate the fuse.
So kind of like striking a match.
Exactly. The Mills bomb, for example, uses a spring-loaded striker that hits the cap when the grenade is released. Strike igniters have been the dominant mechanism since World War II. They're generally considered more reliable and safer to handle.
I can see how having that delay before detonation would be crucial for the thrower's safety. Are there any other techniques for using these time-delayed fuses?
One technique some soldiers use is called cooking the grenade.
Cooking a grenade. That sounds dangerous.
It can be, but it's a tactic used to shorten the delay time before the grenade explodes.
Hmm.
Basically, the soldier holds onto the grenade for a few seconds after activating the fuse, letting it burn down a bit before throwing it.
I guess that would give the enemy less time to react, but it seems incredibly risky.
It definitely requires nerves of steel and perfect timing. Cooking a grenade is usually done when you need a shorter delay to prevent the enemy from taking cover or throwing the grenade back. It can also be used to make a fragmentation grenade explode in the air above enemy positions, maximizing the shrapnel coverage.
Wow, I wouldn't want to be the one trying to time that just right. That's some serious battlefield skill. Speaking of skill, it sounds like these ignition systems are pretty critical for both safety and effectiveness.
Absolutely. The ignition mechanism is the heart of a grenade, and getting it right is essential. It's all about balancing reliability and safety for the user while making sure the grenade detonates as planned to achieve its tactical objective.
Makes sense. So we've talked about the explosive power of grenades, the different types, and those intricate mechanisms that make them tick. It's clear that there's a lot more to these seemingly simple weapons than I ever realized. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that even though the basic design of grenades hasn't changed dramatically since World War II, there's been constant incremental improvement. Can you give us an example of one of those modern innovations?
Of course, one exciting development in recent years has been the introduction of grenades with selectable detonation modes.
Selectable detonation modes. That sounds pretty high-tech for a grenade. What does that even mean?
It means that the soldier can actually choose how the grenade will detonate before throwing it. A great example is the ETMP grenade developed by the U.S. Army. It lets the user switch between fragmentation and blast modes.
So it's like having two grenades in one. That's amazing. How does that even work?
It's all thanks to some fancy electronic fuses. The soldier can pick the mode they want using a switch on the grenade. In fragmentation mode, it acts like a typical fragmentation grenade, scattering shrapnel everywhere. But in blast mode, it focuses all the explosive energy into a powerful shock wave similar to a concussion grenade.
That's incredible. It's like having a multi-tool of explosives.
You could say that. That kind of flexibility is super valuable on the battlefield. It allows soldiers to tailor the grenade's effects to the specific threat they're facing, making them much more effective and versatile.
That's mind-blowing. It seems like even in the 21st century, there's still room for innovation when it comes to grenades. I'm really starting to see just how complex and fascinating these weapons are. And I'm eager to explore their impact on warfare and the ethical questions they raise. But we'll have to save those fascinating topics for the next part of our deep dive. Join us as we continue to explore this explosive world.
You know, it's amazing how grenades have evolved right alongside warfare, always adapting to new challenges and new technologies.
I gotta admit, I thought grenades were pretty basic, but now I'm seeing this whole rich history and variety I had no idea about.
Yeah.
It's like a secret world of explosives.
That's one of the things that makes military history so fascinating. These simple-looking weapons often have surprisingly complex stories. And when you look at how they develop, you really get a deeper understanding of how warfare itself has changed.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that. Each type of grenade, each new design, it tells a story about the problems soldiers faced and the creative ways they found to solve them. It's like every grenade is a little piece of history frozen in time.
That's a great way to put it. They're not just weapons. They're artifacts that show how conflict has changed over time, the cleverness of inventors, and that constant drive to get an advantage on the battlefield.
Okay, before we move on, I have one more question about these modern grenades. You mentioned the ETMP grenade with its electronic fuse. It sounds super high-tech, but with all those advanced features, how do they make sure it's safe? I mean, what happens if there's a glitch and it goes off accidentally?
Safety is always a huge concern, especially with something as powerful as a grenade. So when they design these advanced grenades, they put them through tons of tests and safety checks.
So what kind of safety features do these new electronic grenades have?
For one thing, they have multiple safety mechanisms to prevent accidental detonation. They usually have a regular safety pin, like traditional grenades, which has to be removed before the electronic fuse can even be activated.
Okay, so pulling the pin is the first step, just like with a regular grenade. But what about the electronic parts themselves? How do you make sure those don't malfunction?
They use redundant circuits and safety checks to minimize the risk of anything going wrong electronically. These circuits are designed to detect any potential problems and stop the grenade from arming if something's not right.
So it's like a backup system in case the main one fails?
Right, exactly. The goal is to make these electronic grenades as safe as humanly possible, even in the toughest situations. They do a ton of testing to make sure those safety mechanisms are reliable.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah.
It sounds like they take safety very seriously,
Hmm.
which is good. But with all these fancy features, I bet these electronic grenades are pretty pricey compared to the old school ones.
They are more complex and expensive to make, but the benefits in terms of versatility, precision, and safety often outweigh the cost, especially for special military units or missions where those advantages are crucial.
So it's a trade-off between cost and capability.
Mm.
Makes sense. But it's fascinating to see how technology is changing, even something as basic as a grenade.
Absolutely. And I think we'll see this trend continue as technology keeps advancing. I think the grenades of the future will have even more sophisticated fusing systems, incredible accuracy, and maybe even the ability to connect with other systems on the battlefield.
Networked grenades. That sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. What would that even look like?
It's still early days, but the idea is to have grenades that can talk to each other or other systems. Imagine a bunch of grenades detonating in a perfectly timed sequence, or a grenade that you can set off remotely from a safe distance.
Wow, the possibilities are endless. But we'll have to save those ideas for another deep dive. We've already covered so much about the history and evolution of grenades. We've gone from ancient fire weapons to these super advanced modern explosives. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We've seen how grenades have transformed from basic incendiary devices to precision instruments of war. And as technology marches on, who knows what the future holds for these incredible weapons.
We started this deep dive talking about how the name grenade comes from the pomegranate fruit. And now that I've learned so much about them, that connection seems even more interesting. It's like these little weapons are packed with seeds of destruction, capable of causing so much chaos.
That's a powerful way to think about it. It really captures the two sides of grenades: the potential for destruction and innovation, their ability to change the battlefield and influence how we see war. They remind us that even the smallest weapons can have a huge impact on history.
I think our listeners are leaving this deep dive with a whole new understanding of grenades. We've explored their history, evolution types, and impact on culture. It's been eye-opening.
It really has. But before we wrap up, there's one crucial thing we haven't really talked about: the ethical side of grenades.
That's an important point. We've covered all the technical stuff, the history, the culture, but we haven't really discussed the ethical questions that come with using these powerful weapons, and that's a crucial part of the conversation. So in the last part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring those ethical complexities of grenades and the responsibility that comes with using such destructive force. We've spent this whole deep dive exploring grenades, from their ancient beginnings to their modern forms, their impact on culture, and all the tech in between. But as we wrap things up, we have to talk about the big question: the ethical side of using these powerful weapons.
It's a crucial part of the conversation. We can get caught up in the mechanics and the history, but at the end of the day, grenades are designed to hurt people, and that raises some serious ethical questions.
It's easy to get fascinated by all the different types and how they work, but we can't forget that these things have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. The decision to use any weapon, especially something as destructive as a grenade, it's a huge responsibility. It's not something to take lightly.
So where do we even start unpacking the ethical implications of grenades? It feels like a massive topic.
It is a complex issue, but I think a good place to start is with the idea of proportionality in warfare. Is it ethical to use something as powerful as a grenade when there might be less lethal options available?
That's a tough one. And I imagine the answer isn't always black and white.
You're right. There's a lot to consider: the nature of the threat, the risk of collateral damage, whether there are other tactics available. It's a judgment call that military leaders have to make in the heat of the moment, often without all the information they need.
It sounds like a constant balancing act, weighing the potential benefits against the potential costs.
Exactly. And those costs go beyond the immediate target. We have to think about the long-term effects of using grenades, both for the people directly involved and for society as a whole.
What kind of long-term effects are we talking about?
Well, there's the obvious physical and psychological trauma for those who are injured or killed, but there's also the potential for environmental damage, displacement of people, and the breakdown of trust between communities. These are complicated, interconnected problems that we can't just sweep under the rug.
It really drives home the point that the impact of grenades reaches far beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the ethical responsibility doesn't just lie with the people using the grenades. It also extends to the people who develop them, manufacture them, and authorize their use.
That's a crucial point. It's a shared responsibility that includes policymakers, military leaders, and even everyday citizens who ultimately support the use of these weapons.
I completely agree. We all have a role to play in making sure that weapons like grenades are used ethically and with a full understanding of the human cost of war.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've explored the history, the technology, the cultural impact. But as we wrap up, it's important to remember that grenades aren't just fascinating objects. They have the power to cause immense suffering. And we should always think carefully about the ethical implications of using them.
Well said. At the end of the day, we can't forget about the human side of this discussion. Behind every grenade, behind every explosion, are real people whose lives are forever changed by these weapons.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of grenades. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue to think about the complex issues we've discussed today. Thanks for listening.